Hi, welcome to the Woodland patch pattern. This is a series of 3 videos which are tutorials for making this quilt, this delicious quilt behind me here, using some very delicious fabrics from Newtex in New Zealand called Woodland Friends. We've got little foxes and bunnies, and we've got trees, and so we've got a fabric with trees, fabric just with the foxes, fabric with just the bunnies, and then the forest one with all sorts. And then we've got these other delicious fillers which come in a printed panel stripe, so that there's actually 5 different fabrics across the width of the fabric in basically a stripe all the way along the fabric. So it's kind of been fun to work with, something a little bit different in the way of the fabric, but the fabrics themselves are wonderful. It's come up really nicely. The quilt's about 60 inches square, and what more can I tell you? We'll go right ahead and start making it, I think. So I just thought I'd show you how we go about doing some of the cutting. I'm sure most of you know how to cut. In your pattern, there's a cutting chart here so that we can go through step by step, fabric by fabric. I have already done quite a lot of the cutting over here. That's the more simple stuff where we're just cutting strips off and then cutting those down into squares. So the pattern explains all that to you, but I did think I'd go through one of these fabrics in this Woodland Friends range, because it's been printed with 5 different fabrics along the width of the fabric. So this is the fabric here, and it's the panel stripe, we've called it. So it's one of this range of fabrics, but in fact it's 5 fabrics. So that's quite exciting to have all of those within the one fabric, but now we've got to work out how we're going to cut them up and use them. So for this particular quilt, because we're using them as 5 separate fabrics, I'm suggesting that we just cut the strips apart into the separate fabrics. And we've got a little bit of length going on here. So one of the fabrics we're just going to use just for one of the borders, so it's actually this navy dark one. So we'll cut that, and that's just going to be cut into strips, and it tells you all this in your cutting notes. But the other 4 we're going to cut up into smaller pieces to make some blocks and the border and things like that. So I'll just start by just showing you how I would cut apart one of these strips, and obviously the others are going to be all the same. There's nothing terribly hard about this. I would open the fabric out, make sure that it's all just single thickness, and just cut along that line where the print joins. You may find if you've got a larger ruler it's quite good for something like this. If you've got a smaller board than I've got, you might want to turn it round so that you've got the long length of it going, and then really just cutting just along that join line. It doesn't have to be particularly accurate because you won't be using every little square millimetre of the fabric, or even square inch. So I'm just going to cut that off, and then we'll start cutting one of them up, just to give you a bit of an idea of how you can use some of these fabrics. So you could use this fabric in many ways, but for this particular quilt we're using it as 5 separate fabrics, and it's so much fun to do it this way. So there, I've cut a strip off, so I'll start working with that one. I'll do all these a bit later. You don't have to watch me do every little piece. So in the pattern notes here we've got that we're going to be cutting. So the navy one I've said here, we're just cutting some strips for one of the borders, and then we've got the yellow, the grey, the orange and the blue. So this is our blue one, and most of them are fairly similar, slightly different quantities. And we just need to cut off some pieces. We need, initially to do the larger bits, we need some 6.5 inch squares. So this is about, I think, about 8.5 inches wide each of the fabric strips. So we've got plenty to get our squares out of it there. So I would probably just initially go along and just cut off, trim off the edge so we've got a nice straight edge. And I tend to use the board quite a lot, so I'll come along 6.5 inches and I'll cut a 6.5 inch piece there. I'll come along another 6.5 along here, keeping your fabric nice and flat as you go. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We want to keep them all the same size, and we wanted 3 of these, and this is the same for all 4 of the strips that we're cutting. So we'll get those off first so that we don't run out of fabric for those, and then we can cut them the other way so that we get our 6.5 inch squares. And we're just going to trim again, just trim that off to get a nice square edge. So I'm lining up with my board and using the board for my cutting lines. I find that works really well. If you're consistent with your cutting, the board works fine. And we want that to be 6.5 inches again. So we now have 3 6.5 inch squares already. That was pretty quick. And then we need to cut the other strips and bits and squares from the rest of it. So we need to have 37 2.5 inch squares and 8 4.5 inch strips and things like that. So all of that's listed there. You'll find that you've got enough fabric in this quantity to cut all of those things out. So you may want to cut yourself a long strip to cut your squares. You might want to cut it off in short strips. It doesn't really matter as long as you get the pieces out of the fabric. So we'll do that, and I'll go away and cut the rest of mine up. I'll cut my navy one into the strips as listed on the pattern, and then I'll come back and show you how we put the blocks together. So we finished doing all the cutting, or I finished doing all my cutting. I do like to get all my cutting done. I like to label it if necessary, if you're not sure you're going to remember which bit's which. And so that everything is kind of like making your own kit, so that you can then just work through the steps because you've done all the cutting in one go. However, you may have a preferred way of doing it, and that's absolutely fine. So we've finished the cutting. I tick everything off as I go, and now I'm going to start making the blocks. So we've got these little blocks here. These are very cute, little framed or bordered squares, so nothing terribly hard about those. So we'll just quickly run through. So I've made a couple of different samples here. So we've cut some strips, we've cut some squares, and then we're just going to assort them, whether you put the orange on with the foxes like I have here, or whether you put it with something else. But there's a few to make, so you can mix the colours around. So here I've got one, and I've just started sewing the border on this one. So we started off with a square. We've got a strip, we've sewn it down one side. I'll show you, we'll just go down the other side. So we're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're just going to pop that on there, and then we'll press them and pop the other strips on, just to go through it with you so that you're quite sure how to do it. So, and you can chain piece these, you can have your next one ready, so that you would just be popping that through, following on like that, so that makes it quite a lot quicker too. So you could have all your colours ready in order in a little pile and work through them. Not everyone likes to work that way. I like to work that way. It gets the job done for me. I'm just going to bring the iron closer. And so now I've got these strips on here, and we're wanting to press them out. So I'm going to lift that, pressing from the right side, and just push that fabric over. And you'll find that'll sit over nicely. Turn it round and do the opposite side. So I like to press as I go, because that way I find that everything sits nicely, and I don't have to sort of mess around with things that are a little bit crumpled. And then we've got to put the top and the bottom on. So just the same thing. We'll just quickly stitch these and press them so that you can see the whole block. And again, you can chain piece all these through so that you could do all of these at one time. There's several to do. The pattern tells you how many. And assorted colours, as I said. You can look at the diagram in the pattern, or on the cover there's a diagram and things, so that you can see the colours that I have put together. If you choose to do it the same way, that's fine, and that's certainly what I've cut. The cutting instructions are for. However, if you want to mix them around, that's entirely up to you. This is your quilt. That little block done already. That didn't take too long. So again, I'll just quickly press that so that we can see it finished, and just the same pressing. So I just hold it down, lift up one side, so pressing from the right side, and pop those open like that, and that should sit nicely. They should measure 6.5 inches because there's not too many seams, so there's every chance that they will measure the right size. So the pattern tells you how many to make. You've got to make several of those in assorted colours. And then we're going to go on and make the next block, which is going to just be a 9 patch. Many of you will be familiar with making a 9 patch. It's called a 9 patch because there's 9 patches. Pretty straightforward. So we just need to again, assorted colours, mix them around. You need 4 of one colour, 5 squares of another colour. And I've got my 5 orange by the looks here, and 4 of these little blue ones. And it's just a matter of putting them through, and again you could get all your blocks ready that you're going to make like this and chain piece them through. I'm just going to make one quickly here now, and I'm going to join these 2 bits together, and then I'm going to do a little bit of chain piecing so that we can get the whole block done fairly quickly. So that's those 2, then I'm going to pick up the next 2. And the next 2. Then, so you could go on doing more blocks in the pairs like that, or you can do them individually. And then I'm going to open these out. I can leave those joined up and start adding the next one. So I've got my first one that I sewed, and then I'm going to add the next square to that. And the same thing, open out the next one, add the next square to that one, and they should be alternating in colour. And the third one. Going to cut those apart because it makes it so much easier for pressing. Bring that iron over. And so I'm going to press, when you're making a 9 patch, it's really good if you can press it so that the seams go in opposite directions. So always press to the same colour basically. So I'm going to press to the orange in this case. Often it's good to press to the darker colour. But with a 9 patch, when they're alternating colours like this, always just press to the same colour. So those ones have gone to the orange, so out. These ones are going to the orange, so they're going to go into that centre square. And the reason we do that is so that when we join the rows, the little rows up, which I'll show you in a second, the seams will sit in opposite directions, so that then they'll nestle together really nicely. Okay, that's those pressed. So now we want to lay them out so that we join them together in the right order, because we don't want it to be an odd looking 9 patch. And so now I'm going to pick those 2 up, and because I press the seams towards the orange each time, those seams are going to nestle really nicely now when I sew them together. So you could pop a pin in there to hold them if you like, but often you can just feel it just enough to hold it, and that'll sit really nicely through the sewing there. And then when you get to the first one, you can manoeuvre this one, and again you can just nestle those seams together so that you can feel that it's sitting and it just holds itself there. And again you could be chain piecing multiple blocks here, but I'm just doing the one. So I've done that seam, now I've got to come back and do the next seam. And the same thing, those seams are alternating, so they just nestle in nicely. And there's another block done. It didn't take so long. We'll give that a quick press, and then we'll show you there's a third block that we need to do. So now I'm just going to press the seams in one direction. So I'm just lifting it up and then just letting that fold over with the iron. And you can see there that they've gone both the same way. And that's a nice 9 patch block. So they're mounting in number here. And again, the pattern tells you how many. The pattern is available through my website, GourmetQuilter.com. to purchase and download if you're interested in that. So we've done those 2 blocks now, and now there's one more block. So what we're making is here, as you can see in the picture, that we've got a whole row of these sort of diamond blocks, and then a row of alternating the ones that we've just shown you, the 9 patch and the little framed square. And so now we've got to make these diamond blocks here. So what we're doing there is having a little bit of fun. So I've made a couple of them already here just to show you. They look really nice with their white corners on. So we start off with a square in the middle. We've already cut our squares. So we might have this square, and then we're going to pop corners on them in order to get that nice on point sort of shape. We could have gone around and cut out shapes on point. The squares and things on point just means on the diagonal like that. But that does make life a whole lot more complicated, so I thought this way, if we add corners, we get the same effect, and it's so much easier to do. So I've got one ready to start showing you here. So when we were cutting out, we had lots of the background, or the white squares, and they're going to be our corners. So we want to be able to sew diagonally along them. So you could sit and maybe finger press a corner, or press them with an iron if you wanted to. My preferred method is to draw a line diagonally on those squares. And yes, it takes a few minutes to sit and do that, but you might be chatting to somebody or watching TV. So I've got a mechanical pencil here. You don't want a great heavy line. I'm just going to draw a line along the diagonal, so from point to point. Now we're going to be cutting off those corners. So you may think, well, that's going to be a little bit of a waste to trim away all that. So if you want to save those corners and use them for something else as triangles, of course you can do that. If you want to stitch them around about the same time and make them into little half square, joined up half square triangles, then I would suggest that you do 2 lines of sewing, one through the diagonal and then the second one half an inch away, so that when we've sewn them we can cut between them, and I'll show you how we do that. So I've actually already sewn one on here. So to put our 4 corners on, I'm going to put one on one side and then one on the other side. So we're going to place this square over the corner so that all the edges are even, and we want it so that if we've drawn the second line, that's on the outside. We want this one that's on the actual diagonal to be towards the block. So I'm going to go now and I'm going to sew both of those lines. Again, you can chain piece these. You could have all your blocks ready and just put them through one after the other. So I've sewn that line, and I'm just going to come back and sew the other line so that I can show you when we trim them off that you can save those and use them for another project if you would like to. A little bit more sewing now, but very useful to use those bits for something else. So we have to trim them off, and it's much easier to sew them into the square unit now while they're all joined up than it is if you just have them as triangles. So I'm going to, now I've got my 2 opposite ones on. I've done both my lines of sewing, so now I'm going to cut between the lines of sewing. So I'm going to place my ruler on so that my 1/4 inch line sits on the longer line of stitching there. So I'm cutting halfway between the 2 lines of sewing, and we're going to turn it round, and we're going to do the other one as well. So now I've got 2 corners on my square already. I've just got to press that, and the bits I've trimmed off, which we're not going to need in this quilt, are now all ready to press into nice little squares like that. So that's a great way of using those, doing it as you go, so that you're not wasting bits or having to come back and sew along a diagonal when you've already done it. Why not? So now I'm just going to, again, I'm laying that down, I'm holding that, letting that push that over so that I'm pressing the seam towards the corner, towards the white fabric. So that's my 2 corners on. I now need to come back and put 2 more corners on. So again, I've got my squares, I've drawn my 2 lines. I'm going to position one on there, and these will overlap at the corners, and we start sewing along that longer line. back and do that second line of sewing. If you were chain piecing these through, you'd find this really easy, and to come back and do this second line of sewing isn't too bad at all. I've just got to do the other one, and then this block will be done, and then there's just more to do, more of the same. So now I'm positioning my opposite one on, and again back to the machine. These fabrics are so cute with these little foxes and little animals on them. Just lovely to work with. One could even say that the fabrics are just delicious. So I'm going to trim now again between the two lines of sewing. Around and this side, bring that iron over, and now I'm going to press those two out, and there's a little square on point with that those nice corners. So that's all done, and these little triangle pieces, if we want to use those, are all ready to go. Just go and press them all and pop them in my little stash of things to do another day. But if you did that with all of your corners, you'd have something ready to make perhaps a little cushion or a little border on something. So they're worth saving, worth using, worth that little extra bit of time. So you need to draw all your lines on your triangles or mark that diagonal line somehow, if that's what you're going to do. I've now got some blocks here. I've got a whole lot more to make, which means you've got a whole lot more to make too. So we'll come back and show you how to put them together when I've got them. So I've finished all my blocks according to the numbers that we need in the pattern. The pattern tells you we've got this nice little framed square block here. We've got the 9 patches. I've got all those there. And we've got this one that ends up being a little on point square that I've got there. So that's pretty good. So I thought we'd leave this video here, and we'll come back in the next video and show you how to start putting it together and make the borders.